All right, so in this lesson, we're going to be diving into the exposure triangle. What the exposure triangle is a balance of the three main settings which control the brightness of an image, or more appropriately called the exposure of an image. Each leg of the triangle brings unique characteristics to your photograph which allow for you to produce a beautiful image. These settings are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed is the easiest to understand. It's the speed at which the shutter opens and closes when allowing light to hit your sensor. In layman's terms, shutter speed is how long your camera lets light in. Shutter speed is also directly related to speed in general. This setting is what allows us to either stop motion or show motion in the form of motion blur. Motion blur can be defined as movement shown in your image due to a slower shutter speed. For example, if I were photographing a sporting event, I would want to shoot with a faster shutter speed, let's say of like 1/1000th of a second, to ensure that I have a tack sharp image of that particular moment in time. On the flip side of things, if I'm standing next to a beautiful flowing creek and want to give my viewers a sense of movement from my still image, then I would shoot with a shutter speed of about 1/8 of a second to maybe 3 seconds long. One thing to note with shutter speed is that by speeding up the shutter, you'll begin to darken your image, and by slowing down your shutter, you'll begin to brighten your image. One issue you may find yourself running into is that the scene you're in front of is demanding a specific shutter speed. Securing the type of motion you want might compromise your overall exposure. Aperture is a little bit more difficult to understand because not only does it affect the overall brightness of an image, it also is largely responsible for the depth of field of your images. I know that we briefly discussed aperture and depth of field in the camera body and lens sections in this course. I also promised I would go into greater detail about this in this lesson, which is what I'm going to do right now. Aperture controls the amount of light that is let in when your camera shutter is released. Like I mentioned in the earlier portions of this class, this is controlled by an iris inside of your lens that can be monitored using f-stop values. The smaller the number on the f-stop value, then the larger the iris will open up. The larger the number of the f-stop value, the smaller the iris will be. F-stops can be classified as full stops, half stops, and third stops. You don't have to memorize these, but I will talk about it here briefly just to clear up some photography jargon later on that I will inevitably use. The full stops are f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, and f22. These can then be broken up into half stops, such as f4.8 or f9.5. I know that mathematically it doesn't make sense from what we usually look at as halves and wholes. That's because f-stops are calculated based on a few variables such as the makeup of your lens and camera. Again, I won't jump into the science, but for those of you who are curious, it might be worth your time. Depth of field is the amount of your image that is acceptably sharp. There is a mathematical formula again that you can use to calculate the depth of field. However, we are an automated digital world, so there is no reason to really dive into that in detail. Pretty much the formula factors in the distance from the subject, the f-stop, the circle of confusion, which has me confused, and the focal length of the lens you are using. The areas that are not in sharp focus or are more easily seen as the blurry areas in your photos is referred to as bokeh. I know that we talked about that earlier, so I ramble on about all of this just to say this. Aperture controls brightness and the amount of in-focus elements in your image. The wider the aperture setting, the more light that is let in, thus making your image brighter. When shooting wide open like this, your depth of field will shrink considerably, which creates more subject separation from its background. When you stop down, will begin to close the iris in your lens, which will then darken your image and provide a larger depth of field or more in-focus elements. In efforts to keep this lesson around the same timeline as the others, I will continue to break down aperture in the next lesson, as this is very important to understand as a photographer. There are also a few other elements that exaggerate the effects of the depth of field in your images, such as compression. The last part of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and this stems all the way back from the film camera days when a photographer would use specific film rolls with a certain ISO rating. ISO, all it is your camera's sensitivity to the light you are presenting it with. The lower the number, the more light you're going to need to present your camera with to achieve a good exposure. The higher the number, the less light you're going to need to achieve a quality exposure. The trade-off to higher ISO settings is the fact that digital noise will begin to pop up in your image, especially in the shadow areas. This noise or grain can destroy your image's quality. There are ways to remove this in post-processing. However, it can be difficult and look kind of fake. Modern DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras also handle higher ISO increments a lot better than the beginning days of digital photography. Also why I mentioned to think about this when buying a camera and understanding how cameras handle ISO increments. But still, it's best to keep your ISO increments as low as you possibly can to ensure maximum image quality. Each of the three settings we discuss influence the exposure in our images. However, changing settings also has effects on our images that are good or could be bad if misplaced. That's why it's called the exposure triangle. By dialing in a balance of these three settings, you will be able to create the effects you are wanting, the sharpness you are needing, and the exposure that ensures a viewable image. Welcome to the inside of my camera. This is my viewfinder that I'm currently recording, which is going to be awesome. So we're going to be able to view my settings changes as we go. This is what I look at when I'm out photographing. Some things I change, but most of the time this is what I have up. I have my histogram up where I can read it. I also have the meter down in the bottom there. You can see it has the focus right now because I turned on manual focus just so I'm not accidentally bumping it and changing focus points. But now you can see that white square in the middle of my frame. That's what mine looks like. And then from there, I can actually make it choose a couple different autofocus positions that allow for it to track my subject and all that. So I'm not going to get into that because that's very much brand specific for whatever camera you choose. So that's just what mine looks like. And we're not going to, again, not going to dive into that. So I'm just going to flick that off. So sorry that I don't have an interesting subject. I'm just going to be photographing the base of my microphone stand that I'm recording this on just to make my life easy and try to, it should put the point across for you. So as you can see here, I have actually, I would argue I've underexposed this just a hair. Actually, so here's a teaching point. If you look at my histogram, you'd see that most of the information is actually hanging towards the left side. But if I halfway hold my shutter, you'll see the meter in the bottom is saying that I am dead center on my exposure. And again, that's why I mentioned the different ways of reading exposure. I tend to look at the histogram more than I do the meter. I would argue that I would expose more like this, which the meter's saying it's almost a half stop to a full stop overexposed. However, if I look at the histogram, I'm not peeking any information towards one side and everything is kind of evenly spread out, which I would like to see. Now, this is something that I would like to also drive home because when I'm setting my settings up and if I'm reading just the meter, not the histogram, that if I go with my meter, I could actually underexpose that pretty drastically. That's great, right? We can read if it's overexposed. Now, obviously that looks pretty bright, pretty nasty, or I could underexpose it, right? Can't see it. So how do we go about changing the exposure? Because as we know, everything is made up in a triangle. That's how we create an exposure. So if I change my shutter speed, which is the far left section there, and I slow it down, well, now I can overexpose my image. Now, what if I speed it up? Same thing, I can underexpose my image. So let's get that back to where we think is a good exposure. Now, if you look in the next number, that is my aperture. So I can brighten my aperture or open my aperture up, shoot wide open at f1.2 with this particular lens. It's overexposed. I can darken it and I can underexpose it. And the last one all the way on the right there is my ISO or my ISO. I can again crank it and overexpose it, or I can darken it. So there's a bunch of different things we can use to create a exposed image. As you look here, this is an image that I have exposed, I would say is correctly. I have a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second. I have an aperture of f2.8 and I have an ISO of 3200. So let's snap this photo and take a look. Okay, so here is that image we just captured. As I can tell, everything is decently sharp. Actually, I got my focus off a little bit, but I also have a little bit of blur because of that f2.8 background. There's not a whole lot of noise in it, even though I'm shooting with a higher ISO, and there's no motion blur because I am on a tripod. actually right now. So that's kind of something to my benefit, but that is an exposed image. Now let's say I want to blur out that background even more. And what we learned in the aperture section is that I need to have a lower number that's going to blur my background even more. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so here we are back into our viewfinder. Let's say I want to open up this aperture to an f1.2 to really get that blurry, beautiful background. Now I have an overexposed photo. So what can I do to underexpose this photo or to lower the exposure back to a manageable position? As you can see, the histogram is peaking to the right and my meter is saying I am it's not even reading, it's way up. So there's two things I can do now. Now that I have my aperture set to a setting I like, I can either speed up my shutter speed, can slow the amount of light or the amount of time that it's allowing light to come in, or better yet, if you notice that my ISO is set to 3200, that's a pretty high ISO increment. My camera can handle this easy peasy, but not all cameras can. So I would, as a rule of thumb, always try to lower my ISO, and I would always raise my ISO. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lower my ISO to a setting that gives me a good exposure, and let's snap this image. Okay, so let's look at this image. As I can tell, there is a lot less depth of field. Look how much blurrier this foreground element is compared to the other image. It's actually not that bad. There we go. You can see that it is a lot less blurry. Let's delete this image. Sorry, I had a test shot in there. So we're going to erase this second image. You can tell the depth of field is a lot less blurry than the first image compared to the second because I'm shooting at a faster aperture or a wide open aperture. You can see that the background is a lot more blurred out, especially look at that power cord. And there's a lot less noise. You may not be able to notice it in a compressed video, but there is a lot less noise. Now that's great. Let's talk about another situation now. Let's say that we need to get more of our subject in focus. So let's say we need to shoot at an aperture of f5.6, okay? And I have a subject that is moving, okay? So that means that I need to shoot at a faster shutter speed. So I'm gonna crank this up to what I would say is a good shutter speed for a 50mm lens, and that's 1/100th of a second. The 2x rule, remember that. Now, it's a black, like underexposed mess here. So the only thing I can do is crank my ISO. 51,000. I would never shoot at this, but I just wanna show you what kind of mess it creates. So let's take this shot. Okay, so there we go. There's our image. It has more stuff in focus. In this makeshift world, my subject is tack sharp because I have shot with the correct shutter speed. But the problem is, look at all that grain. Look at all that noise. You see that? Like the fuzziness? That is terrible. That is an unusable image. I don't care what we do in post-production, we will never, ever recover that. So again, that's why I would never crank my ISO that high ever, unless it's like, okay, a great moment. But I would avoid that as long as I can is what I'm gonna say. Now, the reason I had to crank my shutter that high is because I don't have a lot of light in this room to work with. And remember, shutter speed allows for how long we allow light to hit our sensor. Aperture is the amount of light we allow to hit our sensor, and ISO is the sensitivity to that light. So I don't have a lot of light to work with, which is why I would need to shoot at a slower shutter speed or more wide open aperture and a lower ISO. So let's go back and let's look at what we have to do if we want to shoot at a low ISO. Okay, so the last example here, we're going to put ourselves in like a landscape photography or motion blur. We want motion blur. So I'm going to lower my ISO to get rid of that grain. I'm going to slow my shutter speed down, and I'm going to shoot at a tighter aperture to ensure that more things are in focus. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this pen like right here, and I'm going to just barely move it, okay? So we get some motion blur, and okay, so here we are. If I look in, there's like no noise. Absolutely clean image. I got a lot of things in focus, especially if you look at the foreground and the background. I can see that power cable pretty much. I can actually make out some of my fan back there. And there we go. There's the pen. You can see almost like a doubling effect, tripling effect of it. It's not, you can barely even see it. That's because I shot it at 5 seconds. It's kind of hard to show motion blur with that, but there you go. There's some motion blur. Okay, so I hope that this helped drive home the fact of all the things of the exposure triangle we've been talking about. It's kind of more of a practical use. Showed you guys direct changes. This is the approach I always go to. These are the thoughts I'm going through when I'm changing settings and the compromises I make to ensure a great photo. So without further ado, I'm going to end this lesson and we're going to jump into the next lesson, which I'm going to talk to you guys about different shooting modes to help you make better decisions when you're out taking photographs and help kind of remove some of these variables for you to make your life a little bit easier. So let's do that.